This is a work of complete fiction created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely imaginary and bear no resemblance to any real persons, places, or actual events. She didn't even look at him when she said it. Vanessa Hale stood in the center of Adrian Holloway's living room, one hand holding a champagne flute she hadn't offered to share, and told his oldest friend, loud enough for the household staff to hear through the open doorway, that she had already spoken to her attorney about the most favorable timing for the engagement announcement. Not because she loved Adrian, because the Holloway portfolio had just cleared 9 figures, and her family's textile empire was 6 months from bankruptcy. She had a spreadsheet, she had a timeline, she had a plan for everything except getting caught. And Adrian Holloway, standing just outside that doorway with a glass of water in his hand and ice going warm in his grip, heard every single word. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to the channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next, because the stories we tell here don't let go easy. Drop a like and leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from. We genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the beginning, because before any of this, there was a man who thought he understood people. He was wrong. Adrian Holloway had built his fortune the way most people build scar tissue, slowly, painfully, without fully realizing what it was costing him until the damage was already done. He was 41 years old. He owned 4 properties across 2 countries, a private equity firm that managed assets most people would never see in 3 lifetimes, and a mansion in the Connecticut hills that had been featured in 2 architectural magazines he had never actually read. He had a chef named Bernard, who came in 6 mornings a week and left meals in labeled containers in the refrigerator, a groundskeeper named Paul, who kept the gardens looking like something from a calendar, and a rotating roster of household staff that kept the place running with the kind of quiet efficiency that rich people mistake for normalcy. He also had Vanessa, or he thought he did. They had been together 14 months. She was sharp and beautiful and moved through rooms the way certain women do. Like the room had been waiting for her specifically. She laughed at the right moments. She remembered which wine he preferred without asking twice. She wore her ambition like a perfume, and Adrian, who had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, had convinced himself that her particular brand of wanting was something different, something real. He had been planning to propose on her birthday. He had a ring. He had a restaurant reservation. He had, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, allowed himself to believe that maybe the next chapter looked different from the last one. Then came the Thursday evening in November when he came home early from a meeting that ended an hour ahead of schedule, and he stood outside his own living room and he listened to the woman he loved explain to his oldest friend, Carter Webb, exactly what the engagement was actually for. The timing matters, Vanessa was saying. Her voice was calm, organized, the voice of someone reading from notes. His Q4 numbers just posted. If the announcement goes out before December, the press coverage alone increases my family's valuation perception. It doesn't fix the actual debt, but it buys us breathing room with the creditors. Carter had said something Adrian couldn't quite hear. I like him fine, Vanessa answered. That's not what I said. I said the timing matters. There's a difference. Adrian stood there for what felt like a very long time. The ice in his glass of water had gone completely soft. Somewhere outside, Paul was running a leaf blower along the back terrace, and the sound felt almost absurd. This perfectly ordinary noise happening right alongside the exact moment Adrian Holloway understood that he had been, in the most precise and deliberate way possible, used. He walked into the living room. Vanessa saw him first. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, more like the rapid recalculation of someone who had been caught mid-equation. She set the champagne flute down on the side table with the careful control of a person who was already composing their explanation. Adrian, she said. How much? He said. She blinked. What? Your family's debt. How much? Carter stood up from the armchair, which was the right instinct, and quietly excused himself from the room, which was also the right instinct. He had been Adrian's friend for 20 years. He knew when to disappear. Vanessa lifted her chin. I don't think this is... How much, Vanessa? She told him. The number was substantial. It was also, for Adrian, not impossible. That was probably the cruelest part, that the problem she had decided to solve by dismantling his capacity to trust people was a problem he might have simply helped her solve if she had ever once treated him like a person rather than a vehicle. He nodded slowly. "Get out of my house," he said. "I'll have someone send your things." Vanessa left without crying. He had half expected her to cry, or to argue, or to try to explain it in some way that reframed the geometry of what she'd done. She did none of those things. She picked up her bag, smoothed the front of her jacket, and walked out of the room with her back straight and her expression composed. That was the moment Adrian Holloway decided he was done. Not dramatically, not with a declaration or a scene, just done. With trying. With the version of himself that still believed there was someone out there who was going to look at him and see the actual man, instead of the number attached to his name. He canceled the restaurant reservation that night. He returned the ring the following morning. And then he went home, and he went quiet. Barton. The mansion in the Connecticut hills was beautiful in the way that very expensive lonely things tend to be. Immaculately maintained, full of carefully chosen objects, and profoundly, almost aggressively empty of warmth. Adrian had bought it 6 years ago when the firm crossed a threshold that made it feel appropriate to own something with a name. The property was called Ashgrove. He had never called it that. It was just the house. He lived in roughly 4 of its 14 rooms on any given week, 8 Bernard's labeled containers standing at the kitchen island most evenings, and worked late into the night in the study on the 2nd floor because working was the one thing that had never lied to him. The household staff came and went on rotating schedules. Adrian barely registered most of them, not out of cruelty, but out of the particular social blindness that sets in when someone has been wealthy long enough. There were systems. The systems worked. That was what he paid attention to. Elena Brooks had been working at Ashgrove for 7 months when the Vanessa situation happened. She came in 4 days a week, Tuesday through Friday, and her job was essentially the interior: dusting, laundry, light cleaning, restocking what needed restocking, keeping the rooms that Adrian never used from accumulating the kind of neglect that becomes expensive to reverse. She was thorough and quiet and never left things in the wrong place, and Adrian had, in 7 months, exchanged perhaps 40 words with her total. She was 33. He knew this because Mrs. Calloway, the household manager, had given him a staff profile sheet when Elena was hired, and he had skimmed it the way he skimmed documents that didn't require action. He knew she lived in Milford, about 22 minutes from the estate. He knew she had a reference from a previous property in Greenwich. He knew her name. He did not know that her father had died 8 weeks before Vanessa walked out of his living room. He did not know that Elena was waking up at 5:30 every morning to drive her mother to dialysis 3 days a week before coming to work, then coming home to cook dinner and sort medications and sit with a woman who was losing ground quietly and trying not to let her daughter see it. He did not know any of this because he hadn't asked. Chats. It was a Wednesday night in late November, almost 3 weeks after Vanessa left, when Adrian came downstairs at 11:15 because he couldn't sleep and he wanted something. He wasn't sure what. Maybe just to be in a different room than the one where he'd been staring at the ceiling for 2 hours. He found Elena Brooks in the kitchen. She was sitting at the small table near the window that the staff used during their breaks, and she had a paperback book open in front of her, except she wasn't reading it. She was staring at the table. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of tea that had probably gone cold 20 minutes ago, and her expression was the expression of someone who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had just, for a moment, stopped pretending it wasn't heavy. She startled when she heard him. The book knocked sideways off the table and she grabbed for it, knocked over the tea mug in the process, and spent the next 3 seconds making the situation approximately worse before she got it all stopped. "I'm so sorry," she said, already standing, already reaching for the dish towel. I thought everyone was asleep. I was about to leave. I'm sorry about the..." "Elena." He said her name carefully, the way you say a name when you're reminding yourself it belongs to an actual person. "It's fine. Leave it." She stopped, looked at him. He got a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water from the tap and leaned against the counter and didn't say anything for a moment. "You work late," he said finally. I needed to finish the upstairs linen rotation before Thursday." She was still holding the dish towel. She set it down. I'll get out of your way. You're not in my way. She didn't seem to know what to do with that. Honestly, he wasn't completely sure what he was doing either. But the house was very quiet, and he was very tired of quiet rooms. And there was something about her expression when he'd found her, that particular weight, that had landed on him somewhere specific. What's the book? He asked. She picked it up, turned it over. Middlemarch, she said. George Eliot. He raised his eyebrows slightly. That's not light reading. No. A small pause. My professor used to say it was the best English novel ever written. I had it in a box for about 10 years. I finally got it out. Your professor, he repeated. Something shifted in her face. Not much, but enough. I was in school for a while, English literature. I didn't finish. He nodded. He didn't ask why. The look on her face suggested the why was something she carried around with her, and didn't particularly want to unpack in someone's kitchen at 11:15 at night. Is it as good as advertised? He said. She thought about it for a moment. It's about people trying to do the right thing and mostly making a mess of it anyway, she said. So yes, it feels very accurate. He almost smiled, not quite, but something in his face moved a little. He sat down at the table. It was an odd thing to do. He understood that on some level as he was doing it. She was his employee. This was her break table. But he was tired, and the ceiling upstairs had nothing interesting to offer, and she was the first person who had said something to him in 3 weeks that sounded like a real sentence instead of a prepared one. My father gave me a copy of Middlemarch, he said. I don't think I ever read past page 40. Most people don't, she said. She sat down too, slowly, like she was deciding whether it was all right. It takes a while to earn it. He kept recommending books I didn't read. Adrian turned the water glass in his hands. He died 4 years ago. I still have them all on a shelf in the study. Still haven't read them. Elena looked at the table. My father died 8 weeks ago, she said. Her voice was even, careful. He used to say books were the only things that didn't run out. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm sorry, Adrian said. And he meant it in the straightforward way that people sometimes mean things when they're too tired to perform the version of it that sounds polished. Thank you. She wrapped her hands around the cold mug again. Old habit, probably. Something to hold. He was sick for a long time. It didn't come out of nowhere, but it doesn't really matter how long you know something is coming. It still feels like a surprise when it gets there. It does, he said. He meant that too. They sat there for a while longer than either of them had planned. She told him a little about her father, a man named James Brooks, who had driven a delivery truck for 30 years and read 3 books a week and believed deeply in the educational value of public libraries. Adrian told her a little about a man named Frank Holloway, who had run a hardware store in western Massachusetts and would have found the entire concept of Ashgrove both impressive and slightly ridiculous. He would have wanted to know what everything cost, Adrian said. Did you tell him? Sometimes. He always said the same thing. Adrian paused. He'd say, Son, I hope it makes you happy. And then he'd go back to watching the game. Elena looked at him. Not the way most people looked at him. Measuring, assessing, recalibrating based on the number. Just looking. Did it? She said. Make you happy? It was a direct question, the kind that most people in his orbit didn't ask anymore, because most people in his orbit had learned that the answer was complicated, and that complicated things could make rich men uncomfortable. He thought about it honestly. Parts of it, he said. She nodded. That's probably the most honest answer most people could give about anything. He finished his water. She reheated her tea in the microwave. 30 seconds, which turned out to not be enough, and she drank it slightly too cold anyway. He didn't offer to make more, and she didn't ask. It was comfortable in the way that very few things in his life were comfortable, which was to say it didn't require anything from either of them except basic honesty and the willingness to stay in the same room. At midnight, she said she really did need to head home. She had an early morning. He didn't ask why. He just stood up and said goodnight and meant it. She gathered her book and her bag and her coat, and she was almost to the kitchen door when she stopped and turned back. Mr. Holloway, she said. Adrian. She considered that. Adrian. She said it like she was trying it on for size. I hope the rest of the books get read eventually. Your father probably picked good ones. He looked at the door after she left. He didn't go back upstairs for another hour. He sat at the break table with his empty glass and Middlemarch sitting on the table where Elena had left it, and he looked at the cover for a long time, and he thought about his father's bookshelves back home in Massachusetts, and about what it meant to be 41 years old and just now starting to understand how lonely a person could be in a house they entirely owned. He didn't sleep well that night, but it was a different kind of not sleeping than the past 3 weeks had been. Less like lying in a dark room with nothing, more like sitting with something that had just arrived and didn't yet have a name. He was still thinking about it when Bernard arrived at 6:30 the next morning to start breakfast. He was still thinking about it when he sat down at his desk and opened his laptop and found, wedged inside the cover of Middlemarch that she had left behind, a small folded piece of paper where Elena had written down the page number where she'd stopped. Page 214. He picked up the book. He started at page 1. He finished Middlemarch in 11 days. That was not something Adrian Holloway would have predicted about himself at any point in the preceding decade. He was a man who read financial reports, acquisition briefs, market analyses, documents with clear stakes and measurable outcomes. Fiction had always felt like an indulgence he didn't have the right architecture for. Too much space between the words, too much asked of the reader without any guarantee of return. But he read Middlemarch. He read it in the evenings after Bernard had gone home and the house had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, sitting in the study with a glass of water and the lamp on. And somewhere around page 300, he stopped thinking of it as something he was working through and started thinking of it as somewhere he was actually going. He left the book on the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a note tucked inside the cover. The note said, "You were right about page 40. A.H." He didn't see Elena's reaction because he had an early call with the Hong Kong office and was already at his desk by the time she arrived. But when he came down to the kitchen at noon for coffee, the book was gone, and there was a new note in its place, written in the same small, even handwriting as the page number she'd left behind. Most people who make it past page 40 end up finishing it. "What did you think of Dorothea?" He thought about it for a moment, poured his coffee, and wrote back. "Stubborn. Made everything harder than it needed to be. I kept wanting to tell her to just make a different choice." He left that on the table. That evening, before she clocked out, she left him a reply. That's what makes her real. Perfect characters don't need stories. He read that one twice. It started with books, the way certain things start with something small and manageable before becoming something else entirely. Adrian pulled his father's old recommendations off the shelf in the study, a shelf that had been more or less decorative for 4 years, and started working through them in order of spineware, which seemed like as good a system as any for guessing which ones Frank Holloway had actually loved versus which ones he'd bought with good intentions and set aside. The notes continued. Not every day. Sometimes 3 days would pass without anything, and Adrian would find himself glancing at the kitchen table more than was strictly necessary for a man who had a full schedule and an equity firm to run. Then he'd come down one morning, and there would be something waiting, a question about a character, a sentence she'd underlined and wanted to know what he made of it, once just a single word. Thoughts? Written beneath a passage about loneliness that Adrian had to read 4 times before he understood exactly why she'd flagged it. He started leaving books for her in return. Not his father's, but those felt like something he wasn't ready to share yet, or rather wasn't ready to have returned to the shelf without having understood them first. He started buying things. He'd be in the middle of a conference call and find himself making a note on a corner of his legal pad, not about the call, but about a title he'd heard mentioned somewhere, or something he thought she might find interesting based on the way she'd talked about Elliot's structure in her last note. He didn't examine this too closely. What he told himself was that it was a welcome change from the way Ashgrove usually operated, which was to say silently and without surprise. What he told himself was that it was good to use the library for something other than storing expensive first editions he'd bought at auction without reading. Mrs. Calloway noticed. She was a compact, efficient woman in her mid-50s who had managed the household for 3 years and who missed very little about the daily operation of Ashgrove. She didn't say anything directly. She wasn't the kind of person who said things directly unless the situation required it, But Adrian caught her watching him one morning when he was leaving the kitchen after writing a note, and her expression had the particular quality of someone filing information away for later. He ignored it. Elena, for her part, was careful. She had been careful since the first night, since the kitchen conversation that had gone longer than it should have and left her driving home on the dark November road, thinking about the way Adrian Holloway had said parts of it when she asked if his money made him happy. The honesty of it had caught her off guard. She had been working in wealthy households for 6 years, and the wealthy men she encountered were, in her experience, one of two types: the ones who performed warmth because they thought you expected it, and the ones who were simply absent, present in the house but not in any way that registered. She had not previously encountered one who sat down at the staff break table and told her his father would have found the house slightly ridiculous. She thought about that on the drive home. Then she made herself stop thinking about it, because thinking about it was a path that went exactly nowhere, and she had enough actual problems without inventing new ones. Her mother's name was Ruth Brooks, and Ruth had been living with kidney disease for 3 years. She was on dialysis 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, at a clinic in Milford that opened at 6 a.m. Elena drove her there before work on those days and picked her up in the evenings. Ruth was 61 and still insisted on making her own coffee in the mornings, and hated being helped with anything she felt she could technically manage alone, which meant she and Elena had a low-grade negotiation running at all times about what technically managing actually looked like. Her father's absence was everywhere. James Brooks had handled the finances, such as they were, not because Elena couldn't, but because he was good at it, meticulous in the way that people who grew up without much money often are, keeping a ledger by hand even when everyone else had moved to apps. After he died, Elena found the ledger in the desk drawer in his study and sat with it for an hour, looking at his handwriting, the careful columns of numbers before she understood fully what it was telling her. They were fine, but fine was a word that required constant maintenance. Fine meant one unexpected expense away from not fine. Fine meant Elena picking up extra hours at Ashgrove when Mrs. Calloway had them to offer, and saying yes to weekend coverage even when her body wanted to say no. She could not afford to be careless about her job. She could not afford to be careless about anything. So she was careful with the notes. She kept them direct, book-focused. She did not ask him personal questions even when she wanted to. She did not mention her mother or the dialysis schedule or the fact that she still had 2.5 years of literature coursework she'd abandoned when her father's illness started requiring money that her student loan situation couldn't absorb. She kept the conversation, if you could call a series of handwritten notes a conversation, on the safe, mapped territory of fiction, where everything difficult happened to characters with different names. It worked, for a while. So the Thursday it stopped working was in mid-December, cold and gray, the kind of Connecticut afternoon that made the bare trees look like they'd given up on something. Elena was in the second-floor hallway running a dust cloth along the built-in shelves when Adrian came up the stairs with his phone pressed to his ear, a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not angry exactly, more like a man who had been told something he already suspected and was now dealing with the specific exhaustion of being right about a bad thing. He saw her and did the thing people do when they're on a call and pass someone in a hallway. A nod, a slightly apologetic lift of the hand. She nodded back and kept working. He went into the study and closed the door. She could hear his voice through it, not the words but the tone, level, controlled, the particular flatness of someone keeping something compressed that would rather not be. She finished the hallway and moved on to the east sitting room, which nobody sat in, and was dusting the windowsill when the study door opened and she heard him come out and stand in the hallway for a moment without moving. Then he said, through the open doorway, "Do you want coffee? I'm making some." She stopped, looked up. He was leaning in the doorway with his phone in his hand and his tie loosened, and he looked tired in a way that was different from his usual tired, which was the fatigue of a busy person. This was something older. "I'm fine," she said. "But thank you." "I meant—" He stopped. "I'm going to make coffee. If you want some, it's not an imposition." A beat. "Mrs. Calloway isn't here today." She understood what he meant, or thought she did. Not permission exactly. More like an acknowledgement that the normal geometry of the situation was, for the moment, being set aside. She put down the dust cloth. They sat at the kitchen table, not the break table this time, the actual kitchen table, the large one near the windows that looked out over the back garden. December had stripped the garden bare, the rose beds cut back, the paths swept of leaves. Everything waiting. He made the coffee with the kind of focus that suggested he wanted something to do with his hands. She noticed he knew where everything was, not just where it was stored, but the particular order Bernard did things. He'd watched at some point. That was the kind of thing she noticed about people. "Bad call?" she said. He set a mug in front of her. "My CFO quit." He sat down across from her. "He's taking 3 members of the analyst team with him, starting his own firm." He said it without drama, just the fact of it. "I'm sorry," she said. How bad is that?" "It's manageable. Annoying." He turned his own mug in a slow circle. "What bothers me is that I didn't see it coming. Marcus has been with me for 9 years. I thought I knew what he was thinking." She wrapped her hands around her mug. The coffee was good. Bernard's machine, Bernard's beans. But Adrian had managed not to ruin them. "Do you think he knew he was going to do it for a long time?" "Probably." "Maybe he thought you'd try to talk him out of it." Adrian looked at her. "Would I have?" She considered that. "I don't know you well enough to say." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That might be the most accurate thing anyone said to me in months." He picked up his mug. "Most people who know me think they know me better than they do. Easier to just decide who you are and stop checking." She thought about that. "That sounds lonely." "It is," he said, simply, without any effort to soften it or redirect it into something more comfortable. She looked out the window at the bare garden. The sky was the particular flat white of a day that couldn't decide between overcast and something worse. "My father used to say that most people are better at watching other people than they are at watching themselves," she said. "He thought it was the fundamental human problem. Not that we're selfish, but just that we're better at outward attention than inward." "Sounds like he was a thoughtful man." "He was." She paused. "He had a 6th-grade education, and he read more than anyone I've ever known. He would have had opinions about everything in your study. What do you think he'd make of the Faulkner?" "He'd say Faulkner needed a better editor, and you probably paid too much for a signed first edition of something that could have been half as long." This time, Adrian actually laughed. It came out a little rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while but still mostly worked. She hadn't heard him laugh before. It changed his face. Took about 5 years off it, made him look like someone she could almost picture before all of this, before the firm and the house and whatever had happened with the woman whose name Elena had heard mentioned once by Mrs. Calloway in a tone that said everything without saying anything. She didn't push on that, not her territory, but she stopped being quite as careful about the rest. December moved toward Christmas, which Adrian did not particularly celebrate, and Elena didn't have the budget for. The notes continued. The occasional kitchen conversations became a less occasional thing, not every day, but often enough that it started to have a shape, a loose and undefined routine that neither of them acknowledged as such, because acknowledging it would have required looking directly at what it was. He told her about his father's hardware store, a specific memory of being 12 years old and spending a whole Saturday reorganizing the fastener wall, and how his father had paid him $5 and considered it a fair transaction. She told him about her parents' apartment in Milford, small, 3 rooms, shelves her father had built himself along one entire wall of the living room just to have somewhere to put the books. She told him she'd been accepted to the University of Connecticut's literature program on a partial scholarship when she was 24, and that she'd gotten 2 semesters in before her father's diagnosis changed the math on what was possible. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I regret the reason I left. I don't regret what I did instead." She paused. "My parents needed what I could give more than I needed the degree at that specific moment. I knew that then. I know it now. It's just that knowing something doesn't always make it feel okay." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you ever think about going back?" "Every semester," she said. "And then something else comes up, and then another semester passes." She picked up her coffee. "I have the books anyway. Same material. No one to grade my papers." "I'd read your papers," he said. She looked at him. He looked back, and something shifted in the air between them. Not dramatic, not the way those moments are in movies with swelling music and convenient lighting. Just a small, clear shift, like a room coming into focus. He had said something he hadn't entirely planned to say, and she had heard it in the way it was meant, and for a moment neither of them did anything with it. Then she looked back at her coffee and said, "You'd probably argue with all my conclusions." "Almost certainly," he said. "That's what makes it worth reading." She left that evening with her book bag over her shoulder and her coat buttoned against the December cold, and she sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting with the specific quality of the afternoon, the way certain days leave something behind when they end. Her phone buzzed. Her mother texting to ask if she'd remembered soy milk. She had not remembered soy milk. She stopped at the grocery store on the way home, picked up the soy milk and a rotisserie chicken and 2 sweet potatoes, and she was standing in the checkout line when she realized she was smiling at nothing, which was not something she had done much in the past 2 months. She stopped smiling on purpose, which lasted for about 45 seconds. The new year arrived with the particular indifference it always does, the calendar changing and the world staying mostly the same underneath. Adrian restructured the analyst team, brought in 2 people from outside, promoted 1 junior analyst who had been doing twice the work for the wrong title, and had a long, uncomfortable conversation with the remaining senior staff that he handled with the directness he'd always been better at in professional contexts than personal ones. He was better in January than he'd been in November. That was not nothing. He and Elena had by now developed what could only be described as a genuine friendship, though neither of them used that word, and both of them were aware, in the particular way of people who are paying careful attention to something they're not quite ready to name, that it was sitting right on the edge of being something more complicated. She brought him a book in January. Not one he'd asked for. One she'd chosen herself, pressed into his hands on a Tuesday morning while he was coming down the stairs with his laptop bag, saying only Chapter 7 before heading toward the linen closet. He read it that night. Chapter 7 was about a man who had spent 20 years mistaking the accumulation of things for the construction of a life, and who was only now, in his middle years, beginning to understand the difference. He put the book down and sat with it for a while. The next morning he left a note on the table. Deliberate choice of chapter or lucky accident? Her response was already waiting when he came back from his noon call. "I'm not sure those are as different as you think." He read that note 3 times and then put it in the drawer of his desk, which was where the others had been going, he realized, without him making a conscious decision about it. There was a small stack of them now, folded pieces of notepaper in her small, even handwriting. He didn't examine what it meant that he'd been keeping them, but he noticed. February brought a cold snap that dropped the temperature 15 degrees overnight and found a gap in the East Wing's window insulation that Paul, the groundskeeper, diagnosed as a 3-day repair project. Adrian moved his working setup to the kitchen for the duration, which meant he and Elena were in the same room more than usual, which meant the notes stopped being necessary because they were simply in the same place. It was different being in the same space without the mediation of paper. More immediate. More possible to say something accidentally real before the more careful version of yourself could step in. On the 3rd day of the repair work, Elena was reorganizing the pantry shelves, and Adrian was at the kitchen table with his laptop, half working and half watching the ice on the outside window, when she said from inside the pantry, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead," he said. A pause. She came to the pantry doorway, a can of something in each hand. "The woman who was here in November, before I—" She stopped, reconsidered. "You don't have to answer. It's not my business." "Vanessa," he said. "I only heard her name once. Mrs. Calloway mentioned she'd been here." Elena set the cans down on the counter. "She seemed important, and then she was just gone." He closed the laptop. "She was planning to marry me," he said. "I found out that the plan had more to do with her family's financial situation than with anything else." He said it without the particular bitterness he would have said it with in November, more like someone describing weather that had passed. "I ended it that night." Elena was quiet. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Better to know." He looked at the window. What I keep coming back to is that I never asked the right questions. I just decided she was one thing and kept looking for evidence of that thing and ignored the parts that didn't fit. That's what people do, Elena said carefully, when they want something to be true. It's sloppy, he said. He meant it as self-criticism, which was how she took it. It's human, she said, which is the same thing, most of the time. He looked at her. She was standing by the counter with her arms crossed, not defensively, but in the way of someone who was thinking while they held themselves still. There was flour on her left sleeve from something she'd been doing earlier that she hadn't noticed yet. He thought, I know what her handwriting looks like. I know she takes her coffee with 1 sugar and doesn't bother with milk. I know she cried once, in the East sitting room, when she thought no one was on that floor, and then stopped and went back to work. I know she reads in her car during lunch sometimes because she's trying to preserve the quiet before she goes home to everything that needs her there. He thought, I know these things about a person I have been paying very careful attention to without admitting that I'm paying attention. He opened his laptop again. Not because there was something urgent on the screen, but because he needed something to look at that wasn't her face while he reorganized what he was currently understanding about himself. She went back to the pantry. The sound of cans being sorted filled the kitchen. Outside, Paul and his assistant were making progress on the window, the sound of their work carrying through the cold air, ordinary and grounding. By the time Bernard arrived the next morning, the east wing was sealed and the temperature in the kitchen was back to normal, and Adrian had returned his laptop to the study, where it belonged, and the kitchen table was empty again except for a book Elena had left for him with a yellow sticky note on the cover that said, For when the study gets too quiet. It was a collection of short stories. He started it that night. The study was too quiet. It had always been too quiet. He was only now noticing that this wasn't an unchangeable fact about the room, but something that depended entirely on what a person was willing to let in. The short story collection sat on the corner of Adrian's desk for 2 days before he opened it. Not because he wasn't interested, because he had developed a habit, without planning to, of reading the first few pages slowly, almost rationing them, the way you do with something you know you're going to miss when it's gone. It was a new habit. He didn't love what it implied about the state he was in, but he was trying to be more honest with himself about these things, so he acknowledged it and opened the book on a Wednesday evening in late February with a glass of water and the desk lamp on, and the rest of Ashgrove doing its usual impersonation of a place no one lived. The stories were about ordinary people in ordinary trouble, a woman packing up her mother's apartment after a death, a man who drove the same route for 30 years and one day took a different turn, small pivots that turned out to be enormous. Elena had marked one of them with a folded corner. Not a story he would have expected her to flag. Not the most emotionally obvious one, but a quiet piece near the middle about a man who realizes he has confused being needed with being loved, and who isn't entirely sure looking back which one he had actually wanted. Adrian read it twice. He didn't leave a note about it the next morning. Some things you sit with rather than explain. March arrived and the Connecticut hills started showing the first uncertain signs of something coming back to life. Not spring yet, not really, but the suggestion of it, the way the light started staying a few minutes longer each evening. The grounds around Ashgrove began their slow transition from dormant gray to the pale, tentative green that Paul always seemed personally proud of, as though he had arranged it himself. Elena had been at Ashgrove for 9 months by then, and the household had, without anyone declaring it, reorganized itself slightly around the fact of her presence. Not her presence specifically. The story Adrian told himself was still the comfortable one about books and conversations, and 2 people who happened to be in the same place at the right time. But Mrs. Calloway had started scheduling Elena's days differently, keeping her on later into the evenings on the nights Adrian worked late, which was most nights. And Bernard had started leaving 2 cups on the counter instead of 1 without being asked, which Adrian noticed and did not comment on. The thing about living in a house with capable, observant staff was that they always knew more than they let on. Adrian had understood this in the abstract for years. He was only recently beginning to understand it as something that applied to his own life specifically. Carter Webb came for dinner on a Friday in March, the first time he'd been back to Ashgrove since the night in the living room, which they had not discussed, and had both agreed without speaking to leave unexamined for however long it needed. Carter was 52, recently divorced from a woman named Phyllis, who had been his college sweetheart and who had, apparently, spent the last decade being quietly miserable in a way that Carter had managed not to notice until she handed him the paperwork. He was doing about as well as could be expected, which was to say, not particularly well, but functional. Bernard made lamb. They ate at the dining room table, which Adrian used approximately 4 times a year, and drank most of a bottle of Bordeaux, and talked about the CFO situation and Carter's new apartment in the city and a piece of legislation moving through the State House that was going to affect 2 of Adrian's portfolio companies in ways that were annoying but manageable. Then, around 10 o'clock, when the bottle was empty and Bernard had long since gone home, Carter leaned back in his chair and said, "Who's the woman?" Adrian looked at him. "Don't do that," Carter said. "You've smiled 3 times tonight. You don't smile 3 times in an evening. You barely smile 3 times in a week." "I smile." "You acknowledge humor. It's different." Carter poured the last half-inch from the bottle into his glass. "I'm not criticizing. I'm asking." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "She works here," he said. Carter absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of the things Adrian had always valued about him. "On staff?" "Yes." "How long?" 9 months. Carter turned the wine glass slowly. "And is this—" "I don't know what it is," Adrian said, which was true, which was the most honest thing he could have said. "Does she know?" "I haven't said anything." "That's not what I asked." Adrian looked at the table. The remains of Bernard's dinner were still between them, the evidence of an ordinary evening, and he thought about Elena in the pantry, with flour on her sleeve, and her handwriting on the notes in his desk drawer, and the way she'd said that's human when he'd criticized himself for wanting things to be true. "I think she might have an idea," he said. Carter nodded slowly. "And the complication being—" "She works here," Adrian said again, which covered roughly half of it. The other half was harder to say and sounded worse when spoken aloud. That he was 41 years old and his most recent serious relationship had turned out to be a financial instrument, and that the last thing he wanted to do to the one person in his life who seemed to actually see him clearly was make her feel like she had to navigate his feelings on top of everything else her life required of her. Carter said, "You know that when you explain it the way you just explained it, you're not actually saying what you're afraid of." "I know what I'm afraid of." "What?" "Being wrong again," Adrian said, "about what something is." Carter was quiet for a moment. Then, "Well, that's fair." He finished his wine. "Just don't let fair become an excuse to do nothing. You're good at that." Adrian didn't answer, but he didn't disagree. The call came on a Thursday morning in late March. Adrian was at his desk at 8:15 working through a document that required more focus than he was currently managing to give it when he heard the sound from the hallway. Not words exactly, more the specific quality of silence that follows a sharp intake of breath. He was at the door of the study before he'd consciously decided to move. Elena was in the hallway with her phone pressed against her chest, and her face had the look of someone standing on ground that just moved unexpectedly beneath them. She was completely still, the way people get when they're trying to hold something together by not moving. "Elena." He kept his voice level. "What happened?" She looked at him. Her eyes were dry, but her expression was doing something complicated. "It's my mother," she said. "The dialysis center called. She collapsed during treatment." A pause. "They think it's her heart. They're transporting her to Milford General." He had his phone out before she finished the sentence. "I'll drive you." "You don't have to—" "Elena." He said it the way he'd said it that first night in the kitchen, firmly, not unkindly. "Get your coat." She got her coat. He drove her himself. He had a car and a driver available, but the driver would have required a call and 2 minutes of logistics, and she was already sitting in the front seat of his car by the time that calculation finished, her phone in her lap, typing something to someone, probably her mother's doctor or a neighbor she trusted with information like this. Her hands weren't shaking, but they were close. He didn't talk during the drive. He had learned from months of paying attention that Elena Brooks processed things internally before she processed them out loud, and that well-meaning chatter during that process was more interruption than comfort. He drove, and he let her be in her own head, and he focused on the road. It was 22 minutes to Milford General. He knew the distance because he had known for months how long her commute was, which was another thing he'd been carrying around without looking at too directly. The hospital waiting area outside the cardiac unit was fluorescent lit and too warm and smelled like the particular combination of industrial cleaner and stale coffee that hospitals always smell like. And it had the specific emotional weight of a place where people sit with the worst possibilities arranged in front of them, like items on a menu they didn't want to order from. Elena spoke to the nurse at the desk, then to a doctor who came out to meet them. Young, serious, delivering information in the careful way of someone who had learned to give facts without giving false reassurance. Ruth Brooks had gone into cardiac arrest during her dialysis session. They had stabilized her. She was conscious. The situation remained serious. "Can I see her?" Elena asked. "In about 20 minutes. We're getting her settled." Elena nodded. She thanked the doctor with the particular politeness of someone operating on a kind of automatic function. The surface kept intact while everything underneath worked on something more urgent. Then she sat down in one of the waiting room chairs and put her hands on her knees and looked at the floor. Adrian sat down next to her, not across the room. Next to her, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, because there are situations where being in the general vicinity is not the same as actually being present, and he understood the difference. "She was talking this morning," Elena said quietly, "before I left. She was complaining about the news. She does that every morning. She watches the morning news and argues with it like they can hear her." A short, strange sound that was almost a laugh. "She told me not to forget to bring the library book back because it was overdue, and she didn't want a fine." "Library books wait," Adrian said. "She'll argue that when I tell her." Elena looked at her hands. "She's going to be okay," she said. It wasn't quite a question. It wasn't quite a statement. It was the kind of thing people say to the air when they need to hear it said. He didn't offer her an easy answer. She wouldn't have respected one, and he knew her well enough now to know that empty comfort was its own kind of insult. "She was talking this morning," he said. "That matters." Elena looked sideways at him. "You don't have to stay." "I know. You have the Meridian meeting at 11. He had forgotten about the Meridian meeting. He took out his phone and sent Carter a text. "Can you cover 11? Family situation." He didn't examine the word he'd used. He hit send. "It's handled," he said. She looked at him for a moment. One of those looks she gave sometimes that he'd never quite learned to read, which said several things at once and left the decoding to him. "Thank you," she said. "Don't." "Adrian, I'm sitting in a chair," he said. "It's not a large thing." "It is, actually," she said quietly. "You'd be surprised." He thought about that. Thought about all the ways a person could be alone in an emergency. All the time she had probably handled things alone, because her life had trained her to expect that she was the one who handled things, that help was not something that arrived without being negotiated for or paid for or apologized for afterward. He wanted to say something and couldn't find the shape of it, so he stayed in the chair, which was what she'd actually asked for, in the only way she knew how to ask for it. The waiting was 2 hours. Carter texted back that he had the 11 o'clock. His assistant rescheduled 2 afternoon calls without being asked, which he had specifically trained her to do in situations where his calendar and the actual world required him to choose between them. They brought coffee from the vending machine because the waiting room didn't have anything else. And it was bad coffee, watery and slightly scorched, and Elena drank it anyway, and Adrian tried one sip and set the cup down and didn't try again. "Tell me something," Elena said around the 40-minute mark. "What?" "Anything. Just talk to me about something normal. I keep thinking about her heart and I need my brain to go somewhere else for a while." He understood. He thought for a moment. "My father had a dog," he said. "A beagle named Harold. Best dog you ever saw. Absolutely terrible judgment. Would befriend anyone, trusted everyone completely, got stolen once by a neighbor kid and came back the next day on his own and acted like it had been a planned excursion." He paused. "My father cried when Harold died. I had never seen my father cry. I was 16. I didn't know what to do, so I made him a sandwich, and we ate sandwiches in the backyard where Harold used to sleep. Elena smiled. Small, but real. Did it help? The sandwiches? Yes. I have no idea. He ate the sandwich. We didn't talk much, but I think just being in the same place helped. More than words would have. She looked at him. Is that what you're doing now? The chair version of the sandwich? I suppose it is. She made a sound, something between a laugh and a sigh. That's the nicest thing anyone's done for me in a while. Sitting in a hospital chair. You'd be surprised, she said again. And this time she didn't look away immediately. She held his gaze for a moment that stretched past the comfortable duration of an accidental look. Something moved across her face. Not quite what it was, because she was careful, and she was sitting in a cardiac waiting room, and this was not the time or the place, and she knew that as well as he did. But it was the acknowledgement of something, the small, clear recognition of a thing that existed between them, whether they named it or not. She looked away first. He looked at the vending machine. He thought, Carter was right about what I'm afraid of. He thought, I am a man who is very good at managing risk in every context except the one that actually matters. He also thought, she is sitting here 2 feet away from me being terrified for her mother, and she is making gentle jokes about sandwiches, and she is the most genuinely brave person I have been in a room with in a long time. They let Elena in to see Ruth at the 90-minute mark. Adrian stayed in the waiting room. He sent 2 emails and stared at a television mounted in the corner that was running the afternoon news on mute, the closed captioning slightly out of sync with whoever's mouth was moving on screen. He thought about what the doctor had said. Stabilized. Serious. The careful vocabulary of not yet and we'll see. He thought about Elena's face when she'd been standing in the hallway of Ashgrove with her phone against her chest, holding herself completely still. He thought about the fact that she had been managing her mother's illness and her father's absence and her own interrupted life with the kind of quiet endurance that doesn't advertise itself because there's no one around to advertise to. He thought about $200,000. That number had been somewhere in the back of his mind since January, since a conversation they'd had about Ruth's condition that Elena had started to explain and then pulled back from, the way she pulled back from anything that felt like it was approaching a territory where someone might feel sorry for her. He'd done some research afterward, not to be invasive, just to understand. Dialysis bought time. The only real solution for someone Ruth's age and stage was a kidney transplant. But the wait lists were long, the compatibility requirements complicated, and in the meantime the dialysis kept going, and the heart, stretched thin by years of working harder than it should have to, was the thing that eventually broke. He had looked up the cost of the surgery that could address her cardiac situation specifically, the one that would give Ruth the best chance at surviving long enough to get to a better option. The number was in that range, roughly, give or take. He had not done anything with this information because it was not his place, and he knew it was not his place. Elena was not a project. Ruth was not a problem he had been assigned to solve, and there was a very specific, very ugly kind of help that rich people gave that was more about the giver than the receiver, that landed less like assistance and more like a statement about the power differential between 2 people, and he had no interest in being that person. But he sat in the waiting room and he looked at the muted television and he thought about the way she'd said, "You'd be surprised," when he'd told her sitting in the chair wasn't a large thing, which suggested that in Elena Brooks's life, someone simply staying had historically been an event worth noting. He thought about that for a long time. She came back out of the cardiac unit 40 minutes later. She looked different than when she'd gone in. Not better exactly, more settled. The worst possibilities had narrowed somewhat. Ruth was awake and talking, which Elena relayed with the specific relief of someone who had been braced for a different report. She told me my hair looks tired, Elena said, sitting back down. Those were almost her first words. Your hair looks tired. She sounds like herself, Adrian said. She's always like that. She notices things about other people instead of talking about herself. Elena let out a breath that had been stored for about 2 hours. The cardiologist is coming to talk to us at 4. There's something about her heart. A structural problem they identified about 6 months ago. They've been monitoring it. The collapse today? She stopped, reorganized. There's a procedure that her cardiologist in Hartford has been recommending, but it's not covered by the insurance she has. She said this last part carefully, factually. The way she said things, she was trying not to let turn into something that required comfort. How much? Adrian said. She looked at him. Adrian, how much is the procedure? That's not... She stopped. Her jaw tightened just briefly. That's not a conversation I'm having with you. Elena, no. Her voice was quiet but definite. I appreciate you being here. I genuinely do. But there are things I handle on my own, and this is one of them. I'm not going to sit here and have you... She stopped again, choosing words. This isn't something that gets solved by someone writing a check. He didn't push. She was right that it wasn't simple, and she was right that the way he went about it mattered. And she was also clearly someone who had been navigating this alone for long enough that the idea of help arriving from outside her own effort was something her system didn't quite know how to process without all its defenses going up. He let it sit. The cardiologist came at 4, a woman named Dr. Osei, who had a directness Elena seemed to find reassuring. The procedure was called a mitral valve repair. It was not emergency surgery. Ruth was stabilized. But it was necessary, and the timeline was months rather than years. Without it, her cardiac function would continue to decline in ways that the dialysis would complicate further. The cost, without the appropriate insurance coverage, was in the range of $180,000 to $220,000, depending on the facility. Elena listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her face doing the careful, composed thing. She thanked Dr. Osei. She asked 2 specific, intelligent questions about recovery timeline and risk factors. She took the cards and the printed materials. Dr. Osei left. The waiting room was quiet again. Elena, Adrian said, don't. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the printed materials in her hands. Please don't say what you're about to say. I haven't said anything yet. You're about to offer to pay for it. He was quiet. She turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were bright, not from tears exactly, or not only from tears, but from the particular feeling of being at a crossroads that you haven't chosen, and where every available option costs something you're not sure you can afford to spend. I know you mean well, she said. I know you're not. I know it's not coming from a bad place, but if you pay for my mother's surgery, it changes what this is. She gestured, a small motion that took in the 2 of them and the space between them. I don't know what this is, but I know that changing it with money makes it smaller. It makes me smaller. And I can't... Her voice caught, once, briefly. I worked very hard not to be smaller. He heard that. He sat with it. You're right, he said. She looked surprised, slightly. She'd been braced for an argument. You're right about what it could do, he said. And you're right that it's your decision, not mine. He paused. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it, not deflect it. She waited. I'm not offering because I feel sorry for you, he said. I'm not offering because I want to be useful or because I'm trying to do the powerful person thing of solving problems with money. I am not trying to make you smaller. He looked at her directly. I am offering because your mother is in a hospital bed, and there is something that would help her and I have it, and the idea of not using it because of what it might look like feels like exactly the wrong priority. Elena looked at the floor. I know what you're afraid of, he said. I know what the money would change if it's handled wrong. So I'm telling you that if you let me help, and it is your choice, entirely your choice, it's a gift, not a transaction. There's no debt. There's no different expectation on the other side of it about what you are to me or what I am to you. It doesn't change those terms. Those terms belong to whatever is actually happening between us, which I admit I haven't said out loud, and I'm not going to make you deal with that in a hospital waiting room on today of all days. He paused. But the money, that's separate. That's just, what else am I supposed to do with it, Elena? Tell me what else I'm supposed to do with it. She didn't answer for a long moment. Outside, through the window near the desk, The late March afternoon was going gray, the sky getting ready to do something. A few drops hit the glass. The beginning of rain. "You never say things the easy way," she said finally. "No," he said. "I really don't." She looked at the papers from Dr. Ose. Then she looked at him. Her expression was complicated and open in a way he hadn't seen from her before. She'd let down some specific guard, not all of them, just the one she kept in place between this kind of need and this kind of person. "I don't know how to do this," she said, "letting someone help with something this big." "I know," he said. "I'm not good at it either." She made a sound. "We're both terrible at this." "Remarkably bad," he agreed. She almost smiled. The situation around them was still hard and real and not going away, and Ruth Brooks was still in a hospital bed down the hall, and the rain was increasing against the window, and none of it was resolved. But the almost smile was there, small and specific, the kind that belongs to two people who have understood each other about something. "Let me talk to her," Elena said. "To my mother, before anything." She folded the papers carefully and put them in her bag. "She has opinions about everything. She'll have opinions about this." "Of course," he said. "She'll probably try to refuse too. Then you'll both have to be persuaded." Elena looked at him. Something in her face shifted again. That same thing from before, in the hallway of Ashgrove, that she'd been careful not to look at directly. Except now she was looking at it, not moving toward it, not naming it, but no longer pretending it wasn't there. "You came," she said quietly. "You didn't have to, but you came." He thought about sandwiches in a backyard. He thought about Harold the Beagle and his father's inexplicable trust in a dog that kept getting itself into situations. "Yes," he said. "I did." She nodded once, slowly, and then she turned back toward the corridor that led to her mother's room, and Adrian sat in the plastic chair while the rain settled into a steadier rhythm against the window, and the afternoon went dark around the edges, and he thought about nothing in particular and everything all at once, in the way that happens when you understand that something has changed, and you're still in the middle of the moment where it changed, and you haven't gotten to the part yet where you know what it means. He was still sitting there when she came back out, 40 minutes later, with her coat in her hand and her mother's instructions about the overdue library book, and the quiet, exhausted look of a person who had just had a hard conversation and come through it. She said yes, Elena said. Adrian stood up. She also said you'd better not expect a thank you card because she doesn't do those, Elena added, and that she wants to meet you when she's feeling better. She said, and I quote, "I need to see what kind of man this is." He picked up his own coat from the chair. "That seems fair," he said. They walked out of the hospital together into the rain, which neither of them had an umbrella for, and crossed the parking lot at a pace that suggested neither of them was particularly bothered by getting wet, which they were, but which felt like a small and manageable problem against the shape of the evening behind them. He unlocked the car. They got in. She sat with her wet coat and her bag and the papers from Dr. Ose, and looked straight ahead through the rain-covered windshield for a moment before she said quietly, "Thank you, Adrian." He started the car. "Your mother sounds like someone worth meeting," he said. Elena looked out the window. The Milford General parking lot was entirely ordinary, painted lines and light poles and cars going in and out, and somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary, she smiled. Not the careful half-smile she gave when she was keeping herself in check. The other kind. The kind that came from somewhere real. He drove her home. Ruth Brooks had the surgery on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April. The facility was Hartford Presbyterian, which Dr. Ose had recommended specifically for its cardiac surgical team, and the procedure was scheduled for 7 a.m., which meant Elena was up at 4:30 to drive her mother there, and Adrian was up at 5 because he hadn't slept well, and because there was no version of that morning where he was going to sit at his desk pretending to work while Ruth was in an operating room. He drove himself. He didn't tell Elena he was coming until he was already in the Hartford Presbyterian parking structure, at which point he sent a text that said simply, "I'm here. Take whatever time you need. I'll be in the main waiting area." She didn't respond immediately. He bought coffee from the hospital cafe, better than vending machine coffee, though not by a margin worth celebrating, and found a chair near the window and settled in. Her reply came 11 minutes later. "You didn't have to do that." He typed back, "I know." Then, after a pause, "How is she?" Arguing with the anesthesiologist about whether she really needs to count backward from 10. She says it's patronizing. He read that twice and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. "That sounds like someone who's going to be fine," he sent. Elena sent back a single word. "Yes." Binge. The surgery took 4 hours and 17 minutes. Adrian knew this because he watched the clock in the way that people watch clocks in hospital waiting rooms. Not continuously, but returning to it with the specific compulsion of someone who has nothing useful to do and needs the numbers to mean something. He worked for about 40 minutes of it, genuinely, then gave up and read. He had brought the book from his nightstand, one of his father's recommendations, a worn paperback copy of a Richard Russo novel that Frank Holloway had apparently read 3 times based on the spine condition. And he got through roughly 60 pages before Elena came and found him, just before noon, with the news that Ruth was out of surgery and that Dr. Ose was cautiously pleased with how it had gone. Elena sat down across from him. She looked like someone who had been holding a very specific breath for 4 hours and had just carefully let it out. "She did well," Elena said. "They said she did well." "Good," he said. She looked at him sitting there with his father's paperback and his mediocre coffee, and something crossed her face, complex, layered, the kind of expression that contains more than one feeling at the same time and doesn't apologize for it. "You've been here since 5:30 in the morning," she said. 5:45. Traffic was light." "Adrian?" "Elena," he said back in the same tone. She made a short sound that was almost a laugh and pressed her hand over her mouth for a second, and he understood that the laugh was adjacent to something that wasn't a laugh, and that both of those things were reasonable given the morning she'd just had. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you something to eat. You haven't had anything since before 4 a.m. She started to say she wasn't hungry, then apparently recognized this for the fiction it was, and stopped mid-sentence. "There's a place across the street," she said instead. "My mother's been here enough times that I know the whole block." They ate at a diner with vinyl booths and laminated menus, and a specials board written in chalk that had been partially erased and re-chalked so many times the board was more ghost than information. Elena had scrambled eggs and toast and ate with the focused attention of someone whose body had overridden all other considerations. Adrian had coffee and a piece of pie that turned out to be better than it had any right to be. "She wants to see you," Elena said, around the halfway point of the eggs. "My mother, she asked about you while they were prepping her." "What did she ask?" "Whether you were handsome." Elena said this without looking up from her plate. I told her that was irrelevant. "What did she say to that?" "She said nothing is irrelevant." A pause. "She also asked if you were kind." I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. "What was her response?" Elena finally looked up. She said, "Good. Handsome fades. Kind doesn't." She held his gaze for a beat. "She's going to love you, by the way. That's not necessarily going to be simple for either of you." He thought about what that meant. Ruth Brooks deciding she approved of him, with all the complications that came with a mother weighing a man against her daughter's life. The specific weight of that kind of examination. "I can handle being loved by a woman who argues with anesthesiologists," he said. Elena smiled. The real one. The one from the parking lot. Ruth came home to the apartment in Milford 12 days after the surgery, with a list of dietary restrictions that she immediately challenged, a follow-up schedule that she agreed to only under protest, and an opinion about the hospital's television programming that she shared at length with the discharge nurse. Elena had arranged the apartment for the recovery. The bed moved slightly for easier access, grab bars installed in the bathroom that Ruth declared ugly but did not actually remove, a system of medications organized into a weekly pill case that Ruth said made her feel like a very old woman, which Elena pointed out, as gently as possible, was not the worst thing to feel like given the circumstances. Adrian sent flowers. Not the extravagant kind, not the kind that arrive in a box with the giver's net worth implied in the number of stems. He sent a small arrangement from a florist in Milford that Elena had mentioned once in passing, something her father used to buy from for her mother's birthday every year. Yellow tulips, because according to Elena, Ruth believed red flowers were a statement, and she preferred flowers that were just flowers. Ruth called to say thank you. Adrian took the call in the study, standing at the window that looked out over the east garden, where Paul had finally gotten the rose beds to show some color. "You didn't have to do that," Ruth said. Her voice was lower than Elena's, rougher around the edges, the voice of a woman who had spent 61 years having the exact opinion she wanted to have without adjusting the volume for other people's comfort. "I know," he said. "Elena tells me you say that a lot." "It seems to come up." Ruth made a sound he couldn't entirely interpret, something between amusement and assessment. "She also tells me you drove her to the hospital in March, the night I collapsed." "Yes." "And that you sat in that waiting room for 2 hours." "I did." "Why?" It was a direct question, the kind Elena asked sometimes, and he understood now that it was a family trait. This particular preference for the unmediated version of a thing, for asking straight at what you actually wanted to know instead of approaching it sideways. "Because she needed someone there," he said, "and I was in a position to be that person." Ruth was quiet for a moment. He heard her shift on whatever she was sitting on, the apartment couch probably, with the television on mute the way Elena had described her watching the morning news. "My daughter has been handling things alone for a long time," Ruth said, "since before James died. Even when he was sick, she was the one who made calls and managed appointments and figured out what came next. She never complained, not once, not where I could hear." A pause. "I know what that costs. I know what it costs a person to be that strong for that long without anyone being strong back at them." He stood at the window. The garden was quiet. Paul had gone home an hour ago. "So do I," Adrian said, in a different way. Another pause, longer this time. "She talks about you," Ruth said. "Not directly. She's careful. But I've known her for 33 years, so I know what careful looks like on her and what it means." A breath. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself to me. I'm not her father, and she wouldn't thank me for acting like it. But I want you to know that I'm paying attention. Old women with damaged hearts still pay attention." "I would expect nothing less," he said. Ruth made the sound again. This time it resolved into an actual laugh, brief and real. "All right," she said. "The flowers are nice. Yellow was the right choice. Elena told me." "Of course she did." Another shift. "Come for dinner sometime. When I'm stronger, I'll make something. Don't bring wine. I can't have it yet, and I don't want to watch someone else drink it." "I'll bring something else." "Bring the book she keeps forgetting to return to the library," Ruth said. 40-cent fine so far. It's the principal." He smiled. "I'll make sure it gets there." April moved into May, and May had the particular quality of that year of feeling like something that had been held underwater finally surfacing. The grounds at Ashgrove reached the state Paul considered acceptable, which was to say extraordinary, and the house itself seemed to breathe differently with the windows opened and the light coming in at a new angle. Elena came back to full schedule the second week of May. She had taken reduced hours during her mother's first weeks of recovery. Mrs. Calloway had arranged it without being asked, which Elena had accepted with the kind of careful gratitude she extended to things that helped her, but that she hadn't been able to ask for. The first morning she was back full schedule, she arrived to find a package on the kitchen table. Not wrapped, just a paper bag with her name written on it in Adrian's handwriting. The same handwriting from the notes she had been keeping in the pocket of her coat because she hadn't decided yet what else to do with them. Inside was a course catalog. University of Connecticut, fall semester, the English literature program, and a single note, for whenever the timing is right. No conditions. A. She stood in the kitchen with the catalog in her hands for a long moment. Then she put it in her bag and went to find him. He was in the study. The door was open, which was new. The study door had been closed most of the winter. He was at his desk with his reading glasses on, which he only wore when he thought no one was looking, going through documents with a red pen in the systematic way he had of working through things that required decisions. She stood in the doorway. He looked up. Too much? He said. She thought about it. Honestly, the way she did everything. No, she said. But I need you to understand something. He put the pen down, took off the glasses. If I go back, she said, it's because I decided to go back. Not because it's been arranged for me. Not because someone made it easy. She leaned against the doorframe. I'm not saying I don't appreciate it. I'm saying the decision has to be mine, or it doesn't mean anything. I know, he said. That's why it's a catalog, not an enrollment form. She looked at him. You're smarter than you let on sometimes. I let on quite a lot, actually. About business, she said. About the other things you're less forthcoming. He held her gaze. There was a quality to the silence in the study, the late morning light coming through the window, the garden visible beyond the glass, the sound of the house going about its day in the distant background, that felt specific and held, the kind of moment that knows it's a moment. I'm trying to be better about that, he said. She nodded slowly. I know. She pushed off the doorframe. I'm going to start on the east wing, and I'm going to think about the catalog. That's all I'm asking. She was already in the hallway when he said, Elena. She stopped. Your mother called me last week, he said. She invited me to dinner. A pause. I know, she told me. Is that? Yes, she said, before he could finish. It's fine. It's good. Another pause, smaller. She doesn't invite people to dinner. She hasn't since my father. She didn't turn around when she said it. So? Yes. She went to the east wing. He put his glasses back on and picked up the red pen and sat there for approximately 90 seconds without reading anything before he managed to locate the document in front of him again and continue. The dinner was in the last week of May. Ruth's apartment was exactly what Elena had described. Small, 3 rooms, shelves along the entire living room wall that her father had built, and that were packed from floor to ceiling with paperbacks and hardcovers in no apparent order except the order of a person who knew exactly where everything was and didn't need anyone else's system. Ruth herself was smaller than Adrian had pictured, which was a strange thing to realize he'd pictured her at all. She was thin in the way of someone who had lost weight they hadn't chosen to lose, moving with the careful deliberateness of a body that had recently been opened and repaired and was still negotiating the terms of the new arrangement. But her eyes were sharp and dark, and she watched him come through the door with the undisguised appraisal of someone who had decided she was going to form an opinion and was not going to pretend otherwise. You're taller than I expected, she said, which appeared to be her greeting. And you're exactly as I expected, he said. Ruth looked at Elena. I like him already. That's annoying. Elena, who had been braced for some version of this and was still not entirely prepared for the reality of it, went to put the library book on the table. He had brought it, 40-cent fine paid, receipt included as a joke that he suspected Ruth would appreciate. Ruth looked at the receipt and made a sound that was purely satisfied. Dinner was soup and bread and a simple roasted chicken that Ruth had made herself over Elena's protest, because Ruth had opinions about guests eating food she hadn't cooked, and those opinions were not negotiable. It was very good. Adrian said so and meant it, and Ruth received the compliment with the particular grace of someone who had expected no less, but was still glad to hear it confirmed. They sat at the kitchen table, a round table that barely fit 3 people, the kind of table that made conversation mandatory because there was no physical possibility of avoiding it. Ruth asked him direct questions. Not rude, but not cushioned. Where did he grow up? What his father was like. What he did every day specifically, not the abstract answer, but the actual day. He answered all of it. He didn't perform the modest version or the impressive version. He just described his actual life. The calls, the analyses, the decisions, the parts that were satisfying and the parts that had started to feel like they were missing something he hadn't correctly identified until recently. Ruth listened. She ate her soup with the attention of someone for whom eating was still a deliberate act, a recovery still in progress. My husband worked the same route for 30 years, she said during a pause. Came home tired every night, but he came home. She looked at Adrian over her soup spoon. He used to say that what you do for money and what you're for are 2 different lists, and that most people spend their whole lives confusing them. That's a good way to put it, Adrian said. He was a good man, Ruth said simply. Elena got his stubbornness and his taste in books. and the way she won't ask for anything until she absolutely has to. She said this to the room in general, not to Elena specifically, though Elena was sitting right there. She also got his loyalty. He was loyal to a fault, terrible for negotiating anything, very good for everything else. Elena was looking at her soup bowl. "I see that in her," Adrian said. Ruth set down her spoon and looked at him with the full attention she'd been parceling out in pieces since he arrived. The assessment she'd been building all evening had arrived somewhere, he could tell. The eyes had a quality of conclusion. "I'm going to say something that my daughter will wish I wouldn't," Ruth said. "Mom," Elena said. "I'm saying it," Ruth said, not unkindly. "I've had heart surgery. I've earned the right to say things." She looked at Adrian. "She has talked herself out of things her whole life because the timing wasn't right, or the situation was too complicated, or someone else needed more than she did. She's very good at that. It's kept her safe." A pause. "Being kept safe isn't the same as being happy. I don't think she always knows the difference." The kitchen was very quiet. Elena was looking at the table with the expression of someone managing the specific mortification of being accurately described by their mother in front of someone whose opinion mattered to them, which was its own kind of information. "I'm aware of that," Adrian said. He said it to Ruth, but he was looking at Elena. Elena looked up. "I'm aware of that," he said again, to her this time. "I'm not trying to rush anything. I'm also not interested in pretending something isn't what it is indefinitely, because the category is complicated." Ruth picked up her spoon again, satisfied, and went back to her soup as though the matter had been adequately addressed. Elena looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. Then she looked at her mother. "You are incredibly difficult," she said. "Yes," Ruth agreed. "But I'm right." June arrived with heat and the kind of long evenings that make it hard to go inside. Things shifted between them, not with a declaration, not with a dramatic single moment, but in the accumulative way of two people who have been moving towards something for a long time and have finally, quietly, stopped pretending they're standing still. He told her things he hadn't told anyone, not in a single conversation, in pieces, over evenings, the way you give someone the full account of something only after you've trusted them with individual chapters first. The way his marriage to the firm had developed incrementally until it was total. The way the Vanessa situation had felt less like heartbreak and more like confirmation of something he'd already started to suspect. The way certain successes had landed with a kind of silence he hadn't expected and hadn't known how to explain. She told him things too, about the specific grief of watching her father decline over 2 years, the way illness takes someone before death does. About the students she had tutored informally in Milford, neighborhood kids, a few adults, for no pay, because she had needed somewhere to put the part of her that had belonged to literature and hadn't had anywhere else to go. About the dreams she had scaled back so many times that she had lost track of which size was the original. "You should teach," he said one evening. They were in the library, which had become a regular location. He'd started opening it more, bringing work in there sometimes, and she'd taken to reading there during the late part of the day when her tasks were done and the house was settled. "I know," she said. "That's always been the thing." "The degree is the only obstacle?" "The degree and the time and the money and the fact that I have a mother in recovery who needs—" "Elena," she stopped. "One problem at a time," he said. She looked at him across the room, across the library they'd somehow turned into a shared space without discussing it, and said, "You make things sound so simple." "I'm not saying they're simple," he said. "I'm saying they're not all one problem. There's several problems, some of which are solvable. And you're comfortable just solving problems." "It's what I do." "For companies," she said. "For portfolios." "For people too," he said. "If they'll let me." She looked at her book for a moment. "It scares me," she said finally. That's the honest answer. "It scares me to let someone rearrange the problems, because then I'd have to figure out what I do when they're solved." "You live," he said, like it was that uncomplicated, like living was the obvious next step after surviving. She was quiet for a long time. The library had that particular evening quality, the light going amber, the room smelling like paper and old binding, and the faint cedar of the shelves. My father would have liked you, she said. He was suspicious of rich people in general, but you're not a type. He would have noticed that. He thought about James Brooks and his delivery truck and his handwritten ledger and his wall of books. He thought about Frank Holloway and his hardware store and Harold the Beagle and $5 for a Saturday well spent. I think they would have had things to argue about, Adrian said. The best friendships are like that, Elena said. The first person from outside Ashgrove who became aware of the situation was Carter, who had technically known since March and had exercised what was, for him, extraordinary restraint in not saying "I told you so." He encountered Elena for the first time at a dinner at Adrian's in June, which had been arranged as a small dinner with two other couples and had not been specifically billed as a moment of significance, but which was, in the way that these things are when you know what to look for. Carter watched them for about 45 minutes and then cornered Adrian in the kitchen during a break between courses and said, "She argues with you." "Yes," Adrian said. "You like it." "Yes." "You look like a person," Carter said. "You look like the person you were before you started running everything. I want you to know I noticed that." Adrian moved past him to get the wine. "Are you going to keep talking, or are we going back out there?" "Both," Carter said. "I'm multi-talented." The dinner went well. Elena held her own at a table that included a former state senator and a woman who ran a hedge fund and who had the conversational style of someone who expected to be the most intelligent person present until proven otherwise. Elena disagreed with her about something to do with the way urban planning literature addressed income stratification, and the woman had looked briefly surprised and then engaged, and they had continued the argument across the dessert course with the satisfaction of two people who had found an equal. After the guests left, Elena helped clear the dining room in the automatic way she always moved through the house, then stopped in the middle of it when she realized Adrian was watching her from the doorway. "You don't have to do that," he said. "Old habit." She set the plates down. "Also, I find it hard to stand still when there's work available." "I know." She looked at him. "Your friend Carter watches you." "He does." "He was watching you watch me," she said. "During dinner." Adrian didn't deny it. She crossed her arms, not defensively. "This is going to be a thing," she said. "People noticing, people having opinions, people wondering what it means that Adrian Holloway—" "I know," he said. "I know exactly what people will say." "And?" "And I'm 41 years old," he said. "I've spent 20 years managing what other people think about my decisions. I'm tired of it. I'm specifically tired of it as a reason not to do things that are right." He looked at her across the dining room, over the half-cleared table with the candlelight still going. "What people say about it isn't a factor in what I want." She held his gaze. "What do you want, Adrian?" She asked it the way she'd asked him things from the beginning, direct, without a trap in it, genuinely wanting to know the answer rather than the answer she'd decided in advance. He crossed the room. He stood close enough to make the question require a real answer rather than a deflected one. "I want what's already here," he said. "I just want to stop pretending it isn't." She looked up at him. For a moment, she was Elena from the kitchen that first November night, careful and braced and not yet certain which version of this situation she was in. And then she was the version of herself that had been accumulating all these months. The one that had let him drive her to the hospital. The one that had let her mother say the true things at the kitchen table. The one that had started leaving books for him on purpose because she wanted to know what he thought and had stopped apologizing to herself for wanting that. "Okay," she said, not dramatically, not with a speech, just the word, simple and clear, in the voice of someone who had thought about something for a long time and had come down finally on one side of it. He didn't say anything. He reached out and she took his hand and they stood in the dining room of Ashgrove with the candles burning low and the summer evening coming through the open window. And it was not perfect. Nothing about either of their lives was structured for perfect, but it was real, which had always been the rare and more valuable thing. Outside, the grounds were dark except for the lights Paul left on along the garden path. And the Connecticut hills were quiet the way they got in June, full and dense and settled into themselves. Inside, two people who had taken the long way to get here stayed where they were for a while, not moving toward anything else, not needing to. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The world, as it turned out, had opinions. This was not a surprise. Adrian had known it was coming the way you know a storm is coming when the air changes. Not the specific shape of it, not exactly when, but the certainty that something was going to arrive and require weathering. He had spent 20 years in industries where information was currency and privacy was a negotiation, and he understood that the moment something real happened in his personal life, it would become, in some corners, a subject for other people's commentary. What he had perhaps underestimated was the speed. It started in July, 6 weeks after the dinner where everything shifted, and 2 weeks after Elena had met with the admissions office at UConn about the fall literature program. Someone on the household staff, not Mrs. Calloway, not Bernard, not Paul, but someone from the rotating weekend crew whose discretion had apparently reached its limit, had mentioned something to someone, and that someone had a connection to a gossip column that ran in a Hartford lifestyle publication with a readership that skewed toward the exact demographic most interested in what billionaires did with their private hours. The item was small. 3 sentences. Adrian Holloway, the Connecticut-based private equity figure, appears to have found companionship closer to home than his usual circles. Sources close to the Ashgrove estate confirm that Holloway has been spending considerable time with a member of his household staff. The arrangement is said to be ongoing. Elena read it on her phone in the parking lot of the grocery store on a Thursday morning and sat there for a few minutes before calling him. "I saw it," he said before she could speak. "Adrian, it's 3 sentences in a publication nobody outside Hartford reads on purpose," he said. "I'm not worried about it." "I am," she said. "Not because of what it says about you, because of what it implies about me." He was quiet for a moment. He understood the distinction. The piece hadn't named her, but it didn't need to. The framing did the work on its own, the word arrangement carrying the specific implication of something transactional, something that required skepticism about motives. "I know," he said. "I don't want to be—" She stopped, started again. "I worked very hard my whole life not to be the woman who needed rescuing, not to be the story where someone reads the ending and thinks they already know what the beginning was about." "You're not that story," he said. "I know I'm not," she said, "but that doesn't stop other people from telling it." He didn't offer her a clean fix. He had learned enough about her by now to understand that empty reassurance was more insult than comfort, and that what she needed from him in this moment was not a solution, but an honest accounting of where things stood. "You're right that people will tell it wrong," he said. "Some of them will tell it wrong on purpose, because it's more interesting. I can't stop that. What I can tell you is that everyone who is actually in my life, Carter, Mrs. Calloway, anyone whose opinion I care about, knows exactly what this is and how it came to be." A pause. "And the people who don't know us can think whatever they want. I genuinely don't know how to make that matter less, except to say that what they think has no power over what's actually true." She was quiet on the other end. He heard the ambient sound of the grocery store parking lot, a cart being returned, a car door, ordinary life going on at full volume around her. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay. I'm not going to let 3 sentences in a Hartford lifestyle magazine determine what I do with my actual life," she said. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone first." "Say whatever you need to say," he said. "I'm here." She made a small sound. "You have a 10 o'clock." "I do." "Go do your 10 o'clock," she said. "I'll be at Ashgrove by noon." She was at Ashgrove by 11:40, which was not surprising. The follow-up came 10 days later in a different publication, this one online, with a wider reach and a photograph. The photograph was from a public event in May that Adrian had attended with Carter and 2 colleagues, and Elena had come along because it was a literary foundation benefit, and he had thought she might enjoy it, which she had. The photograph was taken at the venue entrance and showed the 4 of them arriving, and Elena was looking at something to the left of the camera while Adrian had his hand at the small of her back, the instinctive placement of a person who was simply aware of where someone else was in space. The caption read, "Holloway and Unidentified Companion at the Whitmore Foundation Gala." Unidentified companion. Elena saw it before he did. She didn't call this time. She showed up at the study door at 9 in the morning with her phone in her hand and her expression doing the specific thing it did when she had already processed something difficult and arrived at a position. I'm not going to be unidentified, she said. He looked at the photo, then at her. No, he said, you're not. I mean specifically. I don't want the next time my name appears in connection with yours to be because someone dug it up. I'd rather it come from us. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her chin at the angle that meant she was prepared to hold the position. If that's what we're doing, if this is real. It's real, he said, without hesitation. She nodded once, taking that in. Then I need you to understand something. If my name is out there, connected to yours, I need to be standing on my own ground when it happens. I need to have started the program. I need to have my own things in order. And I can't be introduced to the world as someone who belongs to your story. I have to already be in mine. He looked at her for a moment. This was the truest thing she had ever said to him, and she had said a lot of true things. The enrollment deadline for the fall semester is August 15th, he said. I know when it is, she said. Have you decided? A pause that lasted long enough to breathe in and out twice. Yes, she said. He waited. I'm going back, she said. I talked to the admissions office again yesterday. They're counting my previous credits. I'll need 3 semesters to complete the degree. I'll do 2 courses in the fall while my mother's still in recovery. Increase from there. She uncrossed her arms. I arranged with Mrs. Calloway to adjust my schedule. 3 days a week at Ash Grove instead of 4. I've already found a way to cover the lost hours with a tutoring arrangement through the Milford Public Library. He sat back in his chair. You arranged all of this without telling me. I needed to know I could do it first, she said, on my own terms, before I told anyone. She met his eyes, including you, especially you. He understood that. He understood it completely. The particular need to establish that a thing was yours before anyone else could claim a share in it. Good, he said. Just that. Good. Something in her shoulders relaxed slightly. She had been braced, he realized, for him to make it about himself, to take the enrollment as a result of his encouragement, to receive it as a product of his influence. The fact that he didn't, the fact that he simply recognized it as hers, was apparently what she had needed to confirm. She came into the study and sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair that had been functionally hers for months, the one with the good reading light, and picked up the book she'd left there the previous week and opened it to her page. He went back to his documents. The morning went on around them. It was the most ordinary thing. It was also, for both of them, a version of something they had never quite had before. August brought heat and enrollment and a minor crisis at the firm that required Adrian in New York for 3 days in the second week of the month. He went, handled it, came back to find that Elena had reorganized the library while he was gone, not drastically, but thoughtfully, moving certain books to more accessible shelves, creating a section she described without irony as books that actually get read, and leaving him a new title on his reading chair with a note, Airport Reading for the Next Time, slightly better than staring at departure boards. He laughed at that. Alone in the library, with the afternoon light coming in, he laughed in the way that happens when something hits you right in the middle of where you actually live. Ruth came to dinner at Ash Grove for the first time in late August. She moved slowly still, with a cane she referred to as her unwanted accessory, and she spent approximately 4 minutes in the front entrance before delivering her verdict on the house, which was, "It's beautiful. It's also enormous. You must get lost in here." "Sometimes," Adrian said. "You need more people in it," Ruth said, which was not, he noted, an observation about the house. She toured the library and ran one hand along the spines of the books on the shelf her father had built. The shelf in her apartment, transported piece by piece in her descriptions to Ash Grove through Elena's stories, and she stood in front of it for a long moment. "James would have wanted to read everything in here," she said. "He would have had opinions about the organization," Elena said from behind them. "He had opinions about everything," Ruth said. Not sadly, with the particular warmth of someone who has made peace with the weight of an absence without pretending the absence isn't there. That was mostly what made him worth talking to. Bernard had made dinner, a proper one, the kind he put effort into, and they ate at the dining room table, the 3 of them, which was a strange and somehow complete arrangement, and Ruth asked Adrian questions the way she always did, direct and specific, and he answered them the same way. and Elena sat between them eating her food and not intervening because she had figured out sometime in the past several months that the two of them did not require management. After dinner, Ruth sat in the library and looked at the shelves for a long time, while Elena and Adrian cleaned up in the kitchen, which they did together, a thing that had become natural enough that neither of them noted it anymore. The easy division of tasks between two people who had learned each other's rhythms without making a project of it. "She's happy," Elena said quietly, at the sink, looking through the pass-through at her mother in the lamplight of the library. "So are you," Adrian said. "It's different on you than I've seen before." She looked at him sideways. "Different how?" "Less like something you're rationing," he said. "More like something you're actually having." She was quiet for a moment, her hands in the dishwater, then, "I keep waiting for the part where it gets complicated." "It's already been complicated," he said. "More complicated," she said. "The part where something breaks." He dried the pan she handed him and set it aside. "Elena." "I know," she said. "I know that's just the old habit talking. The thing where I expect the floor to drop." "Yes," he said. "That's what that is." She pulled the drain on the sink and dried her hands and turned to look at him in the kitchen of Ashgrove, which was by now as familiar to her as any room she had ever occupied, and she said, "I'm working on it." "I know," he said. "So am I." September came and Elena started her first two courses at UConn, Victorian literature and a seminar on American narrative that she had wanted to take 10 years ago when it wasn't available, and had finally arrived in the right semester at the right moment in a way that felt, if you were the type to notice these things, like a coincidence with excellent timing. She drove herself to campus on the first day. She did not tell Adrian the specific time she was leaving. She came home to the apartment in Milford, where she still lived, where Ruth was still recovering and needed someone nearby, where the shelves her father built held all the books that had been waiting. And she sat at the kitchen table with her syllabi spread out in front of her, and felt something she identified after a moment as the specific feeling of a door that had been closed for a very long time opening inward. She called Adrian that evening. "How was it?" he asked. The Victorian seminar professor is 72 years old and has read everything ever written and is either the sharpest person I've ever met or incredibly close to it, she said. She spent the first 20 minutes explaining why most people read the wrong novels and spent the last 20 reading aloud, which she did from memory, which was frankly alarming. "And the narrative seminar? It's going to make me think about things I don't want to think about in ways I can't avoid," she said, which is either a sign that it's exactly right or a sign that I should have taken the other section. "It's a sign it's exactly right," he said. "I thought you'd say that." "I'm predictable in certain ways," he said. "You're really not," she said. "That's one of the things that took me the longest to understand." He was in the study when she called, sitting with his father's Rousseau novel that he had now read 3 times and had stopped trying to pretend was just a book. The lamp was on. The library was visible through the open door, its reorganized shelves in the lamplight looking like something purposeful, which it was. "How's Ruth?" he said. "She's arguing with her cardiologist about the pace of the cardiac rehab," Elena said. He told her she was ahead of schedule. She told him ahead of schedule wasn't fast enough. "That does sound like ahead of schedule to me," Adrian said. Elena laughed. He heard it clearly through the phone. The real laugh, not the careful one. The one that had been appearing more frequently over the past several months in the way that things reappear when they've been stored in the dark for a long time, and someone finally opens a window. The editorial piece ran in October, not the Hartford lifestyle column, something larger. A financial publication that ran a profile of Adrian in conjunction with a restructuring announcement from the firm. And the journalist, who was thorough, had found Elena's name and looked into it, and included 3 paragraphs toward the end that were professionally careful in phrasing and nonetheless carried the particular implication of someone who found the situation curious enough to linger on. The paragraphs described Elena as a former household employee, noted her educational background as incomplete, mentioned the surgery funding, which someone had found, which Adrian had known was always a possibility and had accepted as the cost of doing what was right, and concluded with a sentence that suggested sources close to Holloway had questioned whether the relationship reflected a pattern of decision-making that prioritized sentiment over judgment. Adrian read the piece on a Tuesday morning and called his attorney and then called Carter, and then sat at his desk for a while without calling anyone. Elena read it the same morning on the Yukon campus between her Victorian seminar and the parking structure, standing on the walkway with her bag over one shoulder and the October wind doing something indecisive with the leaves, and she read all 3 paragraphs twice. She called him. "I've read it," he said. "They found the surgery," she said. "Yes." "That paragraph." She stopped. "The way they describe me. Incomplete education. Former employee." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "It makes everything sound like a transaction that went in an unfortunate direction." "I know what it sounds like," he said. "Are you going to respond to it?" "My attorney is drafting something," he said. "But, Elena, I want to be honest with you. Anything I say in response becomes more coverage, more paragraphs. Sometimes the cleanest response to being described wrong is to simply continue being the thing you actually are until the description becomes obviously inadequate." She was quiet. Wind on her end. "That's easy to say when it's about you," she said. "When it's about me. When the word incomplete is what people read." "You're not incomplete," he said. "You're in your 2nd month of a literature degree that you are completing on your own terms, in your own time, while caring for your mother and doing more with your actual intelligence than most people I have ever paid a great deal of money do with theirs." She didn't respond immediately. "I know that," she said finally. "I know all of that. It doesn't stop it from landing somewhere specific." "I know it doesn't." A pause. "I'm sorry. Not for us. I'm not sorry for any of that. I'm sorry that being in my world means your name gets used by people who don't know you as evidence for things that have nothing to do with you." Another silence. "My Victorian seminar professor would say that women have always had to be twice as visible and half as credited," Elena said. "She'd say the paragraph is a genre, a very old one." "She sounds like someone I want to meet," Adrian said. "She'd have opinions about you," Elena said. "I'd expect nothing less." She made the sound that meant she was coming down from the hard place and arriving somewhere more workable. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to class. We'll talk tonight." "Tonight," he said. She went to class. He called his attorney back and said to hold on the response for now. He sat at his desk and looked at the October light coming through the study window and thought about the fact that 2 people trying to build something honest in full view of a world that preferred its stories neat and categorical were always going to be described wrong by someone, and that the only sustainable answer to that was to go on building. He picked up his pen and went back to work. But Ruth was cleared by her cardiologist in November for what he described as a full and remarkable recovery. She received this news with the expression of someone who had expected no less and was mildly disappointed it had taken this long. And then she went home and made a list of things she had been waiting to do and started at the top. The first item on the list was to go back to the public library. She went on a Thursday with Elena, which was how Elena found herself standing in the Milford Public Library at 10 in the morning, while her mother returned 3 overdue books with a total fine of $6.40, which Ruth paid without comment, and which she and Elena had both known for months was going to be significantly more than 40 cents and had not discussed. The librarian recognized Ruth, said she'd been missed. Ruth said she'd missed the place too, in the straightforward way she said things. On the drive home, Ruth was quiet for a while, watching Milford go past the window, the familiar street she'd lived among for 30 years, the particular November light that makes everything look like the last version of itself before the season changes it. "You seem settled," Ruth said finally. "I am," Elena said. Mostly. "I'm still adjusting to it," Elena said. "To things being okay. To not waiting for the part where they stop being okay." Ruth looked at her daughter. "That's from growing up watching your father and me worry about money," she said, "and then watching him get sick. You learned early that okay is temporary. Isn't it?" "Yes," Ruth said, "but temporary doesn't mean less real. The okay you have right now is real. It counts the same as any other kind of okay." She looked back out the window. "Your father used to say that people spend so much time bracing for the end of good things that they forget to be in them." He was like that too early on. He learned. Elena drove and thought about that. He learned because of you, she said. We learned because of each other, Ruth said. That's the point. The library at Ash Grove was different by December. It had always been a beautiful room, good bones, high shelves, the kind of proportions that made you feel like reading was a serious endeavor worth the appropriate architecture. But it had been, for most of the years Adrian owned it, a room that performed its function without actually serving it. First editions in cases. Decorative arrangements. The atmosphere of a library in a house where no one really used the library. Now it was used. Elena's books had migrated there gradually over the months. First one shelf, then two, then a whole section that she and Adrian had argued about in the good way, the way that means two people have enough of a shared reference to disagree about something specific. She studied there on the evenings she was at Ash Grove. He worked there more often than the study now because the study had started to feel too isolated and the library felt like somewhere something was happening. Ruth came for dinner in the first week of December and spent an hour in the library reorganizing a section she had opinions about, which Adrian allowed on the grounds that her father had been the same and it appeared to be a hereditary trait. He made her a cup of tea while she worked, and she accepted it without looking up from the shelves, which he had also come to understand was a family trait, the way of accepting things naturally, without ceremony, as though help was just something that happened and didn't require extensive acknowledgement. After Ruth left, Elena and Adrian sat in the library in the particular quiet that follows a good evening when everyone has gone home. She moved the Fitzgerald, he said. She thinks Fitzgerald is overrated and shouldn't be given the premium shelf position, Elena said. She has said this her entire life about every bookshelf she has ever encountered. She's not wrong about Fitzgerald. Elena looked at him. Don't tell her that. She'll take it as an invitation. He smiled. The real one, the one Carter had noticed back in March, the one that had been appearing with regularity since approximately November of the previous year, and that seemed, if anything, to have become more available rather than less. I've been thinking about something, he said. She waited. I want to fund a tutoring program, he said, through the Milford Library, for adults going back to school, GED, community college, degree completion, the kind of thing where someone who's been out of the system for 10 years can get actual help navigating back in. He paused. It's not your project unless you want it to be. But I wanted to tell you first because the idea came from you, from things you've told me, and it seemed dishonest not to acknowledge that. She looked at him for a long time. Not the complicated look, the weighing one, just looking. That's a good idea, she said. I know some people at the library board, he said. Carter knows the director of the Milford Community Foundation. It's not complicated to set up. Is it because of me? She asked. Specifically? It started there, he said. But no, it's because there are a lot of people in the same position you were in, and some of them don't have the things you had, which were your own intelligence and your father's books, and enough stubbornness to keep going. I'd like to try to give those people something additional to work with. She picked up her book from the chair arm, set it back down. I want to be involved, she said, when I'm further into the program and I have more to give. I want to be part of what makes it work. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. You were expecting it, she said. I know you well enough by now, he said, to expect the best version of what you're going to do. She looked at him, and he looked back. And between them, there was the library and the December quiet, and the shelves her mother had reorganized, and the chair where she studied, and the reading lamp he'd moved closer to it weeks ago without mentioning it. And there was everything they'd said, and everything they hadn't had to say. And there was the particular feeling of two people who had each arrived at a place they hadn't expected through roads they hadn't planned, and who were beginning to understand that unexpected was not the same as wrong. I love you, she said. Not as a revelation. As a statement of fact, the way she said things she had already fully thought through before she said them. I want to say it out loud. I've been thinking it for a while, and I think it's past time to say it out loud. He didn't make her wait for the answer. I love you too, he said. I think I have been for longer than I knew what to call it. She nodded, taking that in with the same direct acceptance she brought to everything true. Okay, she said. Good. Good, he agreed. Outside, December was doing what December does in Connecticut, cold and clear and dark by 5. The stars visible in the way they only are when the air has no patience for ambiguity. The grounds of Ash Grove were quiet. The roses were cut back for winter. Paul had left the path lights on. Inside, a woman who had spent years being strong for everyone else and a man who had spent years being successful for no one in particular were sitting in a library that had finally started to look like it belonged to people who used it, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while. There are stories that end with the dramatic moment, the declaration, the resolution, the clean line, where the trouble stops and the reward begins. This was not that story. The trouble didn't stop anywhere clean. Ruth would still have follow-up appointments, and the dialysis clinic was still a regular fixture of Tuesday mornings, and Elena's degree would take 2 more semesters after this one, and the firm would have its next crisis requiring 3 days in New York, and the world would continue to have opinions about things it understood incompletely. None of that went away. What changed was something more interior than circumstance. What changed was that 2 people who had each been, in their own ways, managing survival had located in the same place something that felt like more than survival. Something that asked more of them and gave more back. Something that required the specific courage not of dramatic gestures, but of ordinary days, of choosing, again and again, to be present and honest and willing to stay when staying is harder than going. That is, when you look at it plainly, the only kind of love that lasts. Not the kind that arrives in the right moment with the right credentials and the right appearance. The kind that shows up in a kitchen at 11:15 on a November night and stays through the hard months and the hospital waiting rooms and the 3 sentences in a Hartford lifestyle column and the years of small adjustments that 2 people make when they are genuinely trying to build something together. The greatest wealth either of them had ever encountered was not in any account or acquisition. It was in the particular quality of being known, fully, imperfectly, without performance, by one other person who had decided to stay. Adrian Holloway had learned something his father had always known, and his hardware store had always quietly demonstrated, that the things built carefully, out of honest materials, by people who understood the work, those things hold. They are not glamorous, they do not photograph well, but they hold. Elena Brooks had learned something her father's ledger had been telling her all along in its careful handwritten columns, that the real accounting is not of money but of time, and that what you choose to spend it on is the only number that finally matters. In the library at Ash Grove, with December outside and the lamp on and the shelves full of books that were actually read, 2 imperfect people sat with what they had built and found it enough. Found it, in fact, considerably more than enough. The path lights stayed on all night. In the weeks that followed, the library became the place where their life together actually lived. Not the grand rooms that the architectural magazines had photographed, not the formal dining room with its long table and its good china, not the manicured grounds that Paul tended with seasonal devotion. The library. The room with the reorganized shelves and the reading lamp Adrian had moved without mentioning it, and the chair that had become Elena's in the way that certain things become certain people's without a transaction or a declaration. Elena's syllabi from the fall semester were stacked on the corner of the reading table next to Adrian's legal pads, their handwriting mixed together on the margins of things. Her notes on Victorian narrative structure, his questions about a passage she'd flagged. The occasional argument continued in ink when one of them had thought of something after a conversation ended. Ruth had come twice more for dinner and had, on the second visit, brought her own book and settled into the armchair by the window and read companionably while Adrian and Elena finished cooking, which was either an act of comfort or an act of appropriation depending on how you looked at it, and which they both considered entirely welcome. Carter came in January and stood in the library doorway for a moment before he said anything. "It looks different in here," he said. "Elena reorganized it," Adrian said, "and her mother reorganized the section Elena reorganized." "I mean, it looks like someone lives here," Carter said. "The whole house. It didn't used to." Adrian looked around the room. The books that were read, the 2 chairs angled toward each other, the marks of two people's daily lives occupying the same space. He had owned Ash Grove for 6 years and had spent most of them in approximately 4 of its 14 rooms, and the place had been, in the technical sense, inhabited without being in any meaningful sense a home. It was a home now. It had become one the way homes actually become homes, not through renovation or acquisition or the right furniture arranged in the right configuration, but through the accumulation of ordinary days in which people showed up honestly and stayed. Elena came in from the hallway with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Carter without being asked, because she had been paying attention long enough to know he took it black, and Carter accepted it and looked at Adrian over the rim with an expression that said everything he was too restrained to say out loud. Adrian looked back with the expression of a man who already knew. Outside, January was doing what it always did, cold and uncompromising and completely indifferent to the business of human happiness. Inside, the lamp was on. That was enough. That had always been enough if you knew where to look.